So basically, what we're doing is we're trying to understand the Rambam. And the problem is that the Rambam asks a kasha, and we don't understand the whole basis, the whole fundamental assumption of the kasha. It doesn't seem like it's a kasha at all. And the Rambam works very hard to answer this question. And all the Mefarshim are trying to figure out what bothered the Rambam. And this question will appear at the end of Halacha Beis, just the very second halacha in Hilchos Talmud Torah. I will try to present two approaches to answer and to explain the kasha of the Rambam, and of course his answer. And it all comes down to the following two psukim. One pasuk is quoted by the Rambam in Halacha Aleph, where the Rambam starts and says that Noshim Avonu Ketanim P'tur Mitalmud Torah Val Aviv Avkot Aviv Chayv L'Lamdu Shenemar VeShinantem Osam Es B'neichen. So that's one pasuk that is the source for the obligation of a father to teach his son Torah, and the son is a katan. Then the Rambam goes on to tell us that lo beno bilvad, but afu adin, the Rambam says you can expand the obligation to include even ben beno. We'll soon see that the Kesef Mishnah vacillates about what's the story with ben bito. And the Rambam quotes a second pasuk to prove that you have to teach your grandson, and that's vodato levanecha lefnei vanecha. Then the Rambam goes on to say that in addition to the chiyuv that's imposed on the father to teach his son, mitzvah kol chacham v'chacham Yisrael l'lamed is kol hatalmidim. There's a mitzvah incumbent on every chacham, anyone who's capable, to teach all the talmidim. Afilu eino beno. So even if it's ben chavero, the chacham has to teach. Shenemar, and here the Rambam quotes another pasuk. This is already the third pasuk. VeShinantem levanecha. And even though the simple pshat in the pasuk is you have to teach your sons, but nevertheless, mipi Shmuel lamdu, we have a tradition that banecha elu talmidecha, that the mitzvah of VeShinantem levanecha applies to your talmidim, even though they're not your biological children. Shatalmidim nikraim banim, that we find in many places that a Talmud is called a ben. And then after this whole presentation in which the Rambam establishes that not only is the father obligated to teach his son, but even a chacham is obligated to teach his son, meaning the father's son, but also his own son and anyone else's son. So the Rambam says, "Imkein lomen itztav al beno." If you see those words in the Rambam, which sounds like the Rambam is saying that the mitzvah of ULemadetem osam es b'neichem, to obligate the father to teach his son, is completely superfluous. It's completely redundant. We could drop it because now the chacham is obligated to teach everyone, including someone who's not his son. So certainly his son is not worse than somebody else's son. So therefore the Rambam is basically postulating that if you didn't have the pasuk ULemadetem osam es b'neichem, you would still derive the chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son to teach his son Torah, just because of the pasuk VeShinantem levanecha, meaning the obligation incumbent on every chacham to teach all the talmidim. So, as I said at the outset, the commentaries are very, very bothered, very disturbed by the Rambam's question because it doesn't really get off the ground. There are different obligations, different psukim, and there's no there's no reason why we would find one of those obligations to be superfluous and unnecessary. We'll mention a few of the examples that are raised by the objections that are raised by the commentaries. Objection number one, what if the father's not a chacham? Notice the Rambam himself stipulates that the VeShinantem levanecha obligation is incumbent upon a chacham. Well, not everyone is to be described with that profile of being a chacham. You might be just a regular Joe, a regular guy, and you're not a chacham. So therefore, I definitely need the obligation of ULemadetem to generate and establish a chiyuv, an obligation upon a father who's not a chacham. So that's question number one. Question number two is the obligation of a chacham is not absolute. A chacham doesn't have to travel all over the world in order to teach everyone's son's Torah. But when the occasion arises and there are students that have to be taught, and he is a chacham who is capable of teaching in that location, he doesn't have to take a Concorde plane, to get to the other side of the world, then he becomes obligated. But it's definitely a conditional obligation. It's not an absolute obligation. If and when the conditions are met and there's no one else to step up to the plate, as we say, so he'll have to do so. But if there are others, it's not like a chacham has to run around the world, tap on every community's door and say, hey, do you need me? I'm here ready to teach. But in the case of a father, vis-a-vis his son, there's no conditions, there are no stipulations. It's an absolute obligation that the father has to teach his son. So why does the Rambam think that the mitzvah of ULemadetem to teach his son is iberic? It's unnecessary. That's not so. Because it generates an absolute chiyuv that would not normally be applicable in the case of a chacham. Next question. In the case of a chacham, he doesn't have to force anybody to come to his class and show up on Zoom once a week. It's purely voluntary. So the Talmud has the option of coming and enjoying the benefit, but we can't force him. There's no compulsion. But in the case of a father and a son, the commentaries seem to assume that the son has to come and learn when his father's ready to teach. It's not a matter of choice. But I think the most profound question on the Rambam is, how can the Rambam ask such a question as if the mitzvah of ULemadetem overlaps with VeShinantem? That's not so. The mitzvah of ULemadetem applies from when the child is Yodel Ledaber. Obviously, we're not teaching him sophisticated Tosusin. But the mitzvah of VeShinantem levanecha is miloshen shinun. Shinun means, some sort of abstract or profound study. And that VeShinantem would not apply to a baby who's 2 years old. Even if the child is precocious and knows how to speak, or it's 3 years old, knows how to speak, that's not within the purview of VeShinantem. So again, just to summarize the problem, the Rambam seems to be grafting, or shall we say, creating an in thy image, a mirror image of two different mitzvahs. One is ULemadetem, obligating the father, and the other is VeShinantem, obligating the chacham. And the Rambam says that they absolutely overlap in such a way that there's no need for the pasuk ULemadetem also, which is l'chora far from true. These two obligations are fundamentally different, one from the other. So what's the imkain loman itztav al beno? What was the Rambam trying to ask? We could go on and ask another question as well. It could be that the father's obligation, this is very tenable, is to teach Torah Shebechsav. The Chacham has to teach Torah Shebal Peh. So there's nothing superfluous and unnecessary about the Chiyuv of ULemadetem osam. It covers a whole different territory. So what is the Rambam bothered by? What's his question?
Where does that come from, the Balpen Ksav? The Balpen Tersha B'Ksav differentiation.
Yeah, that comes from a few places. Number one, you'll see it in the Rambam, in the fact that he says a little bit later on in this parak that Chayav Liskar Melamed, that the father, if he doesn't have the time to teach his son, will hire a Melamed. That's only for Torah Shebechsav. There's no opportunity to pay or to receive payment for teaching Torah Shebal Peh. And furthermore, as we said before, the word VeShinantem, which is Shinun, indicates Torah Shebal Peh. The father's obligation begins Lidaber Bam, as it says in the Pasuk. Lidaber Bam means from the time that the child knows how to speak. That's only Torah Shebechsav. There's no way you can teach Torah Shebal Peh to a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old. And the Rambam says he if he knows how to speak, so teach him Torah Tzivalon and Moshe, teach him a pasuk or two in Kriyat Shema, and lat, slowly but surely, you teach him psukim. But we're not talking about ingenious Torah Shebal Peh. We're talking about Torah Shebechsav. So again, because these questions are so difficult and it's so challenging to come up with some sort of explanation for why the Rambam says V'lomen itztav al b'no, when these are two fundamentally different obligations. One is on the father for a young child, the other is on a chacham for those children that he can teach Torah Shebal Peh. They come around to teach. They're not on the other side of the world. And these two obligations, never the twain shall meet. There's one obligation of the father, and there's another obligation of the chacham, of the Rebbe who's teaching Torah Shebal Peh. So I would like to suggest the following. And it's a little scary because no one says this, so I'm going to really go out on a limb here. And say the following, that Lomen itztav al b'no, he's not asking, why did the Torah have to formulate VeShinantem osam v'spnechem? That whole pasuk is completely superfluous and unnecessary. He's not saying, the Rambam, that there's no obligation on the father that justifies the pasuk VeShinantem osam v'spnechem. For sure, the Rambam would have many, many reasons to agree that we need that pasuk and we need that mitzvah. But the Rambam is asking a slightly different question. And that is the mitzvah incumbent upon the father a unique mitzvah, a mitzvah unto itself, such that even if there would be an overlap between these two mitzvahs, a crisscross in which the father would be wearing two hats, figuratively. He's wearing the hat of a father, and he's also wearing the hat of a chacham. And the Rambam is saying that if you could construct such a situation, would the pasuk VeShinantem osam v'spnechem still be necessary to engender another dimension to the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, meaning he's a chacham, and therefore he's obligated to teach not only his own son, but your son as well. And that mitzvah is derived from VeShinantem levanecha elu talmidecha. Would it be that that same chacham, at the same time that he's obligated in VeShinantem levanecha, is also obligated in ULemadetem osam espnechem? And if he is, and he's wearing two hats simultaneously, that of a chacham and that of an av, of a father, then in that set of circumstances, would there be any justification for the mitzvah of ULemadetem osam espnechem? Because we're dealing with a situation, which I call the overlap, in which the father is obligated to teach his son anyway, even if he wouldn't be his son, because he's included in VeShinantem. Like, here's my case. Let's say the father is a chacham, and let's say the child is very interested in learning. So there's no need to force him. And since the father's a chacham, he's obligated in the mitzvah of VeShinantem levanecha to teach his son. Regardless of ULemadetem osam espnechem. Meaning, once I can construct an overlap, a mitzias, a situation in which whether or not he's the father, he would still have an obligation to teach his son, and the obligation to teach his son would not be based on ULemadetem osam espnechem, but rather on VeShinantem levanecha. Why then? Again, not why in the sense of how do I justify, but why? What is it, what is added? That's why I would say why means what is. Can I prove to you that even when the father is wearing two hats and he's also a chacham, nevertheless, his obligation under ULemadetem osam vis-a-vis his son is still activated. It's still valid. So the child is now 13 years old and has to be taught Torah Sheba'al Peh already. The father is a chacham. As such, he's obligated in the mitzvah of VeShinantem levanecha, but he's also the father. And the Rambam wants to know, would the mitzvahs haseh of ULemadetem osam espnechem, or do these circumstances add anything? In other words, does he leave behind him his status as ULemadetem osam espnechem, as a father, because anyway, he's a chacham and he's chayav to teach this boy? Or do we say no? He always maintains a dual status, and he always remains an av, and he's always obligated under ULemadetem osam espnechem. That is not removed. But then the Rambam says, I have to prove it to you because I have to come up with a construct where we're going to still push the ULemadetem osam espnechem, and there's going to be a nafka mina. Joe, are you?
I mean, is it not clear that if you had the father who was a chacham and there was another chacham, that the responsibility comes first? Isn't this telling you the responsibility comes first to the father, that he should be the one who's teaching him? Is that not it? And would you not say...
Yeah, Joe, at the end of the day, that's what's going to be. And that's how the Rambam is going to prove that the mitzvah of ULemadetem applies even though the father is a chacham, and even though the father would be included under the mitzvah of VeShinantem levanecha. Despite that fact, right? He still carries with him his responsibility on the VeShinantem Osam to teach his son. So you're asking me which Chacham is going to teach his son, right? There's Reuven, and then the Shimon's the father of this child. We'll call the child Chanoch. Then Shimon is going to have to teach. But how do I know this? The answer is I only know it because it's a special, unique mitzvah of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem that generates a special, unique obligation incumbent on the father, and it continues to be obligatory even though he's a chacham. So he has all the elements of both VeShinantem Levanecha and VeShinantem Osam Espenechem. And the Ram wants to know, in such a case, would the mitzvah of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem still have some sort of a content, a substance, a meaning, a validity? Would it still be applying? And the Ram is going to answer yes. It's going to be very important in the case of Kedima, where there are two sons to be taught. One is your son, the other is somebody else's son. And because there's not only a mitzvah of VeShinantem Levanecha vis-a-vis so-and-so's son, but you're in addition, you're obligated under VeShinantem Osam Espenechem as a father to teach this son because he's your son. And if we didn't have VeShinantem Osam Espenechem, then all sons are equal in the eyes of the Lord, and you would have no rhyme or reason to choose one over the other. The fact that this guy is your son is irrelevant, because VeShinantem Levanecha means teach your Talmudim. But now that we have a special mitzvah of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem, that's what the Rambam is looking for. Now we can justify why there's a Kedima, and Shimon is going to have to teach his son Hanoch, and why? Because of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem. If we only had VeShinantem Levanecha, then flip a coin. I don't know if Shimon has to teach, his son any more than he has to teach anyone else's son. Because VeShinantem Levanecha doesn't generate a special chiyuv. It's just a general chiyuv that every chacham has to teach all the talmidim. But not so in the case of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem. There's a specific exclusive chiyuv on the father to teach his son Torah. And that mitzvah continues even when there's an overlap and you're also, meaning the father is also chayav midin chacham, midin VeShinantem Levanecha. So the nafkamina now, says the Rambam, to illustrate and prove to you that he's still obligated VeShinantem Osam as a father, even though anyway we'd have to teach his son midin chacham and VeShinantem Levanecha, but VeShinantem Osam is going to teach me that his obligation vis-a-vis his son continues, and therefore if he has a choice now, he could be Makayim two mitzvahs, two birds with one stone. If he teaches his own son, he'll be Makayim the mitzvah of VeShinantem Levanecha because his son is no worse than anyone else's son, and on top of that, he'll be Makayim the mitzvah of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem. So again, I just want to reiterate the way, I think it's a little bit radical, but the way I'm trying to interpret the Rambam's not looking for a justification for VeShinantem Osam. He knows that VeShinantem Osam must be there in the Torah to generate certain obligation that would not be derived from anywhere else. So he's not looking for a justification for the parsha of VeShinantem Osam Espenechem. I think that's the assumption that bothered all the Mefarshim and sent them packing, if you know what I mean. But rather, he's looking to prove that there would be a significance, halachically, to continue the chiyuv as a father, even though he now has a chiyuv of a chacham. Meaning that the VeShinantem Osam Espenechem continues to exist in the overlap situation with VeShinantem Levanecha. That's what I want to suggest.
And would you also say, sorry, that that this shows you that there, with regards to the teaching,
that what?
Would you also say, sorry, that with regards to the teaching, it's giving you this understanding, this emphasis that there's got to be a certain love in the giving over of the Torah, because the Father, Hashem saying by having it that the Father gives it over, there's the stronger the connection, the stronger the love that's the person who would do it. Would you say that that's got something to do with it as well?
You see, Joe, I mention this very often when we have these discussions. Your approach is not incorrect, don't get me wrong, but it's an approach of what I call tamei mitzvahs, meaning,
Sorry.
no, don't, it's a very good approach, but it's not the approach that in other words, your approach could be correct, but only after we arrive at the conclusion, meaning once we have a given, then you can add that explanation that maybe the Torah wants that extra element of the father teaching the son, which will introduce a love relationship that enhances the learning of the Torah. But first, I got to get to the position where that chiv of the father still exists. Meaning, you might have argued that, look, he's chayv as a chacham, VeShinantem v'necha, his son is not inferior to anyone else's son, then it comes under VeShinantem v'necha. It's a whole, just a hodgepodge of all the children, all the Talmidim, and let him teach them. And the Rambam wants to point out that no, that's not so, that the mitzvah of ULemadetem still continues to exist. And in this overlap situation, the father wears two hats, and he's obligated in two mitzvahs simultaneously. He'll get credit as a chacham under VeShinantem v'necha, and at the same time he'll get credit as a father under ULemadetem v'shinantom. But that's a big chiddush, because you would have said, intuitively, that forget about ULemadetem v'shinantom. He's now chayav as a chacham. There's VeShinantem v'necha. I don't need another mitzvah. So that's what the Rambam adds. You need another mitzvah for kedima. Because now you have to be makdim your son over Yedem's son. Why? Because you have the mitzvah of ULemadetem v'shinantom. Because that mitzvah still applies even after you're obligated under the mitzvah of VeShinantem. Yeah, Bobby?
Under normal circumstances, the chiyuv of VeShinantem v'necha will come first.
Why is that?
Because it's your mitzvah to teach your son Torah Shabbat is earlier.
Oh, so ULemadetem is going to be first.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. You said VeShinantem. Yeah, ULemadetem. Yeah, ULemadetem is going to come first. So
you're sort of mushba v'omed, like you already have the chiyuv of that. So how can the v'divarta bam like come and how can that knock it off?
What you're saying is that it makes sense that VeShinantem v'necha, which comes later than ULemadetem v'shinantom, would not undermine and neutralize the original mitzvah that was already chal of ULemadetem v'shinantom. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry. Can
I argue with that? Because
go ahead.
We know that, because as the Rav is saying, if his father is not able to give him over on a higher level, it does get knocked off. So it's not necessarily a direct connection between the two.
It doesn't get knocked off. He still has to hire somebody to teach his son.
Understood, but from the standpoint of the actual giving over, I'm just asking.
I mean, in a sense, Bobby, I could ask the question after Tchiyas HaMesim. Like, let's say, for example, the Gemara sometimes comes up with these kind of nafkaminas. Let's say the father dies before the child is born, and then he's resurrected when the child is bar mitzvah. So at that point, two mitzvahs emerge: ULemadetem v'shinantom and VeShinantem v'necha.
I mean, you don't have to go so far. You could say that he was away, or he was in Medinas Hayom. You don't have to say
right, but then he was really chayav, even if he's in Medinas Hayom. But what I wanted to suggest was that all of these things that you're saying are all correct. The Rambam is just, the Rambam is one step behind you. You're already a step ahead of the Rambam. The Rambam is at the step in which he wants to know whether ULemadetem is a mitzvah that adds something to VeShinantem, just in abstract terms. The explanations you could give later on that, well, he started with ULemadetem, or it's an ava relationship between a son and a father that's going to enhance his Torah study. Fine. But on a purely conceptual level, up in the Lufterein, is there ULemadetem when there's VeShinantem? Or should we just say that VeShinantem falls by the wayside? And that's what the Ram wants to establish, that the ULemadetem is relevant as a special mitzvah on the father, a unique mitzvah that continues to persist and exist even after the father is obligated under VeShinantem. So that's Hakofa Aleph. But now I want to suggest another pshat. And I'm sorry if I'm, I'm stuffing this all into one shir, but I've been working on this for days now. I mean, again, if I didn't have menachos on my table, I would be working on it even more. But lately, Baruch Hashem, menachos has smiled a little bit to us. I mean, it's still challenging, but it's not as bad as, Pigel and all that. Or Kmitza versus Torah Salavona, whatever it is. But besides teaching after I finish this year in another yeshiva, whatever. So here's what I want to suggest. Im kein lomen itztav. Now take a look at the Rambam. And the question is, how do you divide up the Rambam? I'll explain. When the Rambam in the middle of Halacha Beis raises the question of Im kein lomen itztave, etc., we assume, and that's how I think all the commentaries assume, that the Im kein lomen itztave is going back to Halacha Al. Meaning, and the beginning of Halacha Beis, meaning the obligation that's unique through the zera, through the descendants and the relatives. However, and therefore we went ahead and we said, well, the Ram was bothered. Is there VeLimadetem osam esnechem when there already is VeShinantem? Fine, but now I want to take a twist, and I want to divide up the Rambam in a different way. I want to suggest that the Halacha Beis should be divided before the question of the Rambam in Kein Lomen Itztava, should be divided in half. The first half is an expansion of Halacha Aleph, meaning that the chiyuv of the father on the VeLimadetem should be expanded to include his grandson as well. And why? Because the Torah says, V'odatel v'nechel l'nei v'nech. Fine, period. Now, at this point, I'd like to start a new paragraph in the Rambam and put a split there. And the Rambam says, not only is there an obligation incumbent on the father and the grandfather under these psukim, VeLimadetem and V'odatem, El mitzvah kol chacham chacham Yisrael. At this point, we start a new paragraph, all of which is based on the pasuk VeShinantem levanecha. And when the Rambam says, therefore, Im kein lomen itztavad, he's referring to the mitzvah kol chacham v'chacham and the mipi hashmua. He's not going back, as we said until now, in the first round, to VeLimadetem osam and V'odatem and the responsibility of the father, grandfather to teach the son and grandson. No. He's focused exclusively on VeShinantem levanecha and mipi hashmua lamdu bonecha elu talmidecha. And the Im kein lomen itztave is a question on the word bonecha. It says VeShinantem levanecha. And the Rambam understands that from the fact that it says levanecha, which even though mipi hashmua we learned that the word bonecha means talmidecha, but nevertheless we have to take the word bonecha at face value. Like we say, if you're familiar, ein mikra yotzev b'dei pshuto. It's very nice mipi hashmua, but mipi hashmua cannot replace the simple, straightforward pshat in the pasuk. And that pasuk says, VeShinantem live vanecha, to your sons, your biological sons. In which case, if the Rambam understood it that way, then the father's obligation to teach his son is inscribed, if I could use that word, it's written in the pasuk VeShinantem levanecha. Why? Because I take the pasuk VeShinantem levanecha on two levels. On one level, which we call the Pshuto Shel Mikra, the Torah is talking to the father. Otherwise, why did the pasuk use the term banecha? On another level, which is called Mipi Hashmua, we're going to interpret banecha to mean talmidecha, and we're referring to a chacham teaching ben chaver. But why does the Torah say VeShinantem live vanecha? That's what's bothering the Rambam. In Keilam and it's Taval Beno. Why is there a tzivui in the pasuk of VeShinantem levanecha to include the father? Because in any event, the father is obligated because of the mitzvah VeShinantem of ULemadetem also mispneicha. So the Torah went out of its way, says the Rambam, to include the father in VeShinantem levanecha, which is totally unnecessary. Why, asks the Rambam, did the Torah have to expand the mitzvah of VeShinantem by using the word banecha to include even the father? As if the Torah is addressing a tzivui, a mandate to the father. Why is that necessary? We already have a mandate imposed upon the father. So what the Rambam now is looking for is he's looking for an additional chiyuv because of VeShinantem, in contrast to the other pshat that we said before in Akaf Aleph. There we were trying to justify why ULemadetem and whether ULemadetem continues to apply even after VeShinantem. Now he's asking a different question. Why was the father included in the pasuk VeShinantem? As if to say that the father is obligated in VeShinantem. Why is that necessary? Why do you have to subsume the father under the obligation of VeShinantem when in any event he's obligated under ULemadetem? But again, you're going to have to assume, if this is a pshat in the Rambam, that the Rambam holds that the father's obligation includes Torah Shebal Peh, not just Torah Shebechsav, which, by the way, I found in many, many commentaries, especially in the Torah, in the name of the Ramah, who says that the father's obligation is to teach the son Kol Torah Kula, Torah, Nevi'im, Ksuvim, Mishnayos, you name it. It's all there. So therefore, what that means is that when the child is ready for Torah Shebal Peh, the father is obligated to teach Torah Shebal Peh because of ULemadetem. Because although ULemadetem is unique in that it kicks off even when the child is only Odei L'daber, and ULemadetem is unique because it obligates the father to teach Torah Shebechsav, but in addition, it obligates the father to teach Torah Shebal Peh. And by the way, that premise that I just gave you, I found in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. Now, you don't have to be a Lubavitcher to appreciate the Rav Shulchan Aruch. And his work on Hilchas Talmud Torah is classic. No one moves a spot without looking in the Rav Shulchan Aruch. It's called the Kunshas Achron, Hilchas Talmud Torah. And there he writes clearly that ULemadetem Osam includes the entire gamut of the Torah. Now, again, there are issues about whether the father has to pay out of pocket for the education, the Torah education of his son. And here there might be a difference between a child and a gadol, meaning after bar mitzvah, and difference between Torah Shebechsav and Torah Shebal Peh. Yes, there are issues here. But fundamentally, what we're saying is that it seems, upon the expression ridiculous, for the Torah to go out of its way and include the father under VeShinantem. The Torah could have just easily said VeShinantem litalmidecha. But why did the Torah say no? VeShinantem livanecha. Apparently, the Torah wants to establish a chiyuv of VeShinantem vis-a-vis the father. That the father has VeShinantem to teach his own son. Mitam Shinantam. And then we have another halacha called Mipi Hashmua. And that Mipi Hashmua says that not only does the father have to teach his son, but even the chacham has to teach this guy's son, Ben Chaver. But included in VeShinantem are two levels of chiyuv. One level of chiyuv is what I call pshuto shel mikra, talmidecha, VeShinantem levanecha. I'm sorry, levanecha, your banim, and that's a chiyuv of VeShinantem on the father. And then there's another level of mipi hashmua, and there we're going to read it VeShinantem letalmidecha. That's a chiyuv on every chacham, but not to undermine the, shall I say, fundamental, basic level of VeShinantem levanecha, meaning banecha, and the obligation of the father. So again, I'm just trying to summarize the two approaches that I'm suggesting. The first approach was, would ULemadetem continue to persist and have an impact on the chiyuv of a chacham vis-a-vis his own son? And the second shot is, what justifies the fact that the Torah sort of like has to repeat the chiyuv of the father in the context of VeShinantem, as if to say that within VeShinantem there's a special chiyuv incumbent upon the father, and the Rambam proves this from the halacha of kedima, that if there's a chacham who's got two young boys to teach, right? One of them is his son, the other is your son. But because the Torah in VeShinantem put the father first, like you say, the phrase, put your right foot first. So in this case, the Torah put the ben first, because it says VeShinantem levanecha. The mipi hashmua does not have the ability to completely negate, the simple pshat in the pasuk. And the pasuk says, banecha. And now the pella is, which I think is what the Rambam is bothered by, why do I need this? Why did the Torah have to take the father and place him into the context and the chiyuv mitzvah of VeShinantem? Why was that necessary? If in any event, the father's chayav mishum ULemadetem. So what I'm going to suggest now, and this is the punchline of the shir, how many minutes do we have left? Not too much, but see what we can get in. What the Rambam is going to tell us is that if we only had ULemadetem without VeShinantem levanecha, the pshuta shel mikra, I could not derive and establish the din kedima. Why? Because the son has the same status as anyone else's son, as far as VeShinantem levanecha. So then why would ULemadetem osam have any impact on setting up kedima? So I know that, Bobby's going to say, well, ULemadetem came first. I don't think that's enough. I think what you have to do here is you have to set up VeShinantem as a whole new mitzvah. And within that mitzvah, we would have to find a basis to justify kedima. Under the halacha of ULemadetem, I would not be able to establish a kedima over ben chavero. And the reason for that is because we get into VeShinantem. Once we get into VeShinantem, what's the difference between the son and anyone else's son? Meaning, ULemadetem is a special chiyuv of the father vis-a-vis his son. Like we find pidyon haben, we find milah. These are called mitzvahs ben al-av. And Talmud Torah is also mitzvah ben al-av. This is not really Talmud Torah. This is a whole cluster of mitzvahs where the father has to worry about his son. That's very nice on a personal level between a father and a son, but what impact is it going to have on VeShinantem? VeShinantem is a whole different mitzvah. VeShinantem is a mitzvah to transmit the Torah from one generation to the other. Who says that it's more important for you to transmit the Torah to your son than it is to somebody else's son? And therefore, ULemadetem would not be sufficient unless we found a basis in VeShinantem for an obligation on the father. And the basis for that is the Torah's use of the word banecha and pshuto shel mikra. Okay, we'll stop here. I tried my best, to explain the Rambam. And I'd love you to go over it, but that's what I have. All right, so let me wish you all a great week.